Many elements of Japanese culture is famous around the world, from ass-kicking martial arts to adults with an unhealthy obsession with anime and a myriad and litany of adult entertainment. The one piece of Japanese culture has survived and remained unchanged for centuries. That is the art of the geisha. Geisha or gaiko are professional entertainers who are trained in the art of entertaining powerful and wealthy men. Where in past centuries they entertained emperors and shogunate rulers, in modern times they're a common feature of businessman parties and banquets. The Japanese word geisha literally translates to mean art person, as they are professionally trained in all manner of entertainment. Singing, dancing and playing all manner of traditional Japanese instruments are all part of a geisha's repertoire. Additionally, geishas are also known to be masters of conversation. Their true role is just to entertain their guests and to provide a comfortable atmosphere for their wealthy clientele. In centuries past, geisha were a common feature throughout Japan. They would even be found further afield in places like Taiwan during their Japanese occupation. These days they can still be found in some major cities, including Tokyo and Kanazawa. However, above all else, the former capital of Kyoto always has and always will be the true heart of geisha culture. I'm here in Gion, and this is a region in Kyoto, probably the most famous region. And here traditionally where the geishas are, where they entertain guests and such. And these are the streets where they're found. Though the culture is in decline compared to years past, the life of a geisha is still taken very seriously. From as young as 15 years old, aspiring geisha will start their long path of 5 years of training. During that time, they're trained in all aspects of communication, hospitality, and a few traditional arts. After an introductory exam and training period, the determined and talented few will go on to become apprentice geisha, otherwise known as maiko. After a few more years of training, only then will they become full-fledged geisha. So where can you meet one of these fascinating individuals? This can only be done by visiting a local tea house or an Ochaya. This is where geisha are hired to come to entertain their guests. These places are highly traditional, and as such they only grant access to trusted customers. So you're only allowed to come if a trusted customer acts as your guarantor. These places don't even give you a bill. Instead, they just add up all the cost of the food, the dinner, hiring the geisha, and even the transport for the geisha, and they charge it to the customer's bank account at the end of each month. So what happens in an Ochaya? Simple, you have a good time. Within reason, of course. Flaming sambucas and belly button shots are discouraged. You're there to eat and drink to your heart's content, and the geisha's job is to keep you entertained and to ensure that you never have an empty glass. And they're not afraid to tell you to down your beer. They'll even play a few drinking games with you. But I think Ring of Fire is off the table. Though it may still sound pretty exclusive, there are still ways that a humble tourist can meet a geisha. Just be aware that they're incredibly expensive experiences and very high class, so it's not just a meet down the dive bar. Conveniently for us gaijin, due to the decline of the industry, they've started to become a little less selective with their guests. So pretty much any fat-walleted tourist can attend one of these events. Many hotels and travel agencies will act as the trusted guarantor. That's actually how I got to meet a geisha, or more accurately a maiko. But I don't care what anyone says. As far as I'm concerned, I met a real geisha and no one can tell me otherwise. You can actually tell the difference between a geisha and a maiko by the kimono that they wear, the markings on the back of their neck, and the style of lipstick that they use. How much does it cost? Well, way too much for a cup noodle eating backpacker to afford. It costs around 50,000 yen to hire one geisha for the night. And that's without considering the price of the meal, which you'll also have to cover, which is between 10,000 to 30,000 yen. Oh, and as most geisha don't speak English, if you would like to have a translator, then you'd have to cover the price of that yourself. If you're someone who can't afford to take out a small loan to pay for the services of a geisha, then don't worry, there's still some cheaper alternatives. In Kyoto, for example, there's a daily performance at the Gion Theatre, which is specifically targeted towards tourists. However, these performances are mostly done by Maiko, but close enough. The cheapest option you have, and an experience in itself, is spotting a geisha walking along the streets. Now this sounds way easier than it actually is. In fact, you should consider yourself pretty fortunate if you happen to run into one of these elusive creatures. Your best bet is to hang around these geisha districts when the sun begins to set, typically between 5 to 6 o'clock. As this is prime dinner time, this is when most geishas are making their way towards their appointments for the evening. And as they have important places to be, they're not exactly going to hang around on the streets. This makes life way more difficult for the tourist because they typically use the back alleys and short taxi rides so they can avoid the waiting tourist horde. And there's a good reason they don't want to be seen on the streets, because tourists are a fucking nightmare. The thoughtless, ignorant foreigners that we are, we tend to easily forget that these ladies are not a figure of novelty. They're not there for our amusement. They're businesswomen on their way to a very important appointment. They're not going to hang around to take photos, and neither do they appreciate people standing in their way trying to get that perfect shot. It's such a problem that in fact taking pictures along these streets is now banned and can result in a heavy fine. And it's for that reason that I didn't take a single photo when I was there. None at all. It's also important to bear in mind the red herring that constantly walks through the streets. The fake geishas. It's pretty common to find people walking along the streets in kimonos, mostly tourists, but some people go a step further and have the full geisha regalia. Obviously it's still early right now, but practically the only geishas you see are Western tourists dressed up as geishas, which is just so sad and pathetic in my eyes. Why would you do that? To me, it's just as sad and pathetic as going to Scotland and wearing a kilt, going to France wearing a beret and carrying around a fucking baguette. It does take a bit of practice to tell them apart, but as soon as you see the signs, it's pretty easy. A true aficionado can tell straight away just by the kimono and the design of the makeup. But even for the uninitiated, there are still some pretty easy signs to look out for. Ichi. If you see one sauntering along the streets in no real rush, she's fake. Geishas have places to be, they don't have time to hang around on the streets. Ni. That also means if you find a geisha willing to take photos are all smiles and laughs when interacting with the public, again, she's fake. Geishas don't have time for your shit. San. No geisha will be seen dead holding a phone or taking a photo of themselves. Those will be the attention-seeking Instagrammers. Now there's a very common question that often comes up when talking about geishas. Now if their sole purpose is to entertain men, do they entertain them in other ways? No, absolutely not. But there is a reason for the misconception. Now the roots of geisha culture begins as far back as the 1200s with a group known as the Shiroboyashi, who were also trained in the art of entertaining gentlemen who indeed provided extra services. The first official geisha started around the 1700s and weren't women at all. They were men, though slowly over time their position were replaced by women. Though other groups of entertainers would go out of their way to satisfy their male clientele, geishas were forbidden from partaking in such activities. So why does this myth exist? Well, that's thanks to our good old friend American GIs. Post-World War II wasn't the best time in Japan, and there was a considerable amount of American military stationed throughout the country. These randy American soldiers during their off time would often fraternize with ladies of the night, who were often dressed as geishas, so they mistook them for the real thing. As such, American soldiers would discuss with their comrades and people back home about the wonderful evening they spent with a geisha girl, without realizing they weren't even the real thing. So in conclusion, no, they're not. Regardless of your reasons for coming to Japan or whatever your interest may be, without a shadow of a doubt, you must dedicate some time to expose yourself to this fascinating culture and meeting a real geisha for yourself.